This is Jim Henson. He's the director of the Texas Politics Project. It has a lot of really great educational resources, polling information, a whole host of things there. And obviously, given the name, it is very Texas focused. However, there's a lot that's there that also applies nationally. And I would encourage all of you to check it out as a resource. And with that, I will let Jim take it away.
You know, I was just talking to some folks in the Austin Press Corps, or the Texas Press Corps, that I know here from, you know, having done this for a while. And I thought a lot about different ways of approaching this. And, you know, I may have read too much into what Ann told me, and we'll see. But the way I've kind of approached this is to do a few slides that are really pretty basic. And I was saying to Jasper a minute ago that, you know, I'm always wary in talking to reporters about trying to find the sweet spot between acknowledging that a lot of you have had training, background, experience on the subject, and not wanting to talk down to people or, you know, come off as overly sort of lectury about these things. So I've got a pretty light slide deck here with a little bit of stuff stuffed in the back in case, you know, we want to open up some other areas. As I was saying to Jasper, the colleague that I work with the most, Josh Blank, and we have a master deck that's about 120 slides, and don't worry, that's not what I brought, that we draw on for various kinds of things. Some of them are much more technical. You know, we both did, I can't remember who the group is, but we regularly do a presentation for international reporters and international journalists. And I started to draw on that, but I realized that was kind of pitched the wrong way in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a long section in there on kind of protecting yourself and protecting your subjects that's not as relevant here. So I've opted for something light. So I'll talk for a little bit and open it up for questions, and feel free to say, hey, you know, that seemed like there was hand waving or whatever. And if you want to, you know, drill down into anything that I talk about in the general sense, I'm more than happy to do that. And I kind of got the impression it was structured that way. You know, and I was saying, right, exactly. And well, which is, you know, the nature of the job, I suppose, yours, not, you know, maybe mine. So I'm going to start with some basic stuff. And then, you know, what I'll do is kind of talk about evaluating polls, drill down a little bit, you know, into the sort of softer sense of how to contextual, you know, how the things I think are important in contextualizing polls and polling data. And then talk a little bit, you know, really just off a bullet pointed slide, frankly, about my thoughts on polling data, Statehouse coverage, and things that are a little bit particular to my mind if you're on a Statehouse beat that I think, you know, applies to some degree nationally, but is a little bit different. And you know, I'll tell you right now, the one thing I don't have in here, because I can pretty much recite it by rote or give you the site, is like what happened in 2016 and 2020. I kind of feel like people have beat that to death. Probably a lot of you have already written the hell out of it, looked at it, whatever. But if you want to talk more about that, you know, I'm reasonably frank about that, and happy to, you know, the baseline sources for those really are the two APOR reports. So it's a notion of and most professions do this, political parties do that, in the same way that the Republicans did the 2012 postmortem. You know, there were 2016 and 2020 postmortems on what went wrong and what directions we should go, done by the American Association of Public Opinion Research, APOR. Both of those are really the best things to look at for drilling down into that. And if you've not seen those, just ask me and we'll do that. Okay, so, you know, when we think about at the broadest level, when we're kind of thinking, what should you do when you evaluate polls? There are three kind of basic buckets of things, and I'm not really, you know, this is the section that's usually followed by about 90 slides, and I'm not going to do it that way. You know, what do you know about somebody's sampling strategy? You know, how did they collect their participants? What was the underlying population that they were trying to sample? How can you understand what the notion of the underlying population is in relation to what somebody is asking you to take seriously, right? And I think, you know, in an election cycle, inevitably, what this really gets down to is, you know, a fairly daunting kind of task ultimately, particularly in a system like the United States with low voter turnout, you know, at least 51 different sets of election laws filtering the electorate into the actual, you know, period of voting. And that is that we're always trying to approximate a population. And frankly, a lot of my more technical colleagues really hate it when I say this, but I say it anyway, which is you're actually trying to sample a population that doesn't actually exist when you're trying to sample it, because you don't know who's going to vote. And so, you know, again, one of the saws about election coverage is, you know, ask people about their likely voter screens. What is a likely voter? Know the difference between, you know, the concentric circles of, you know, the eligible, you know, the voting age population, the eligible electorate, the registered electorate, the electorate on election day that actually shows up. Somewhere cutting across there and congealing during the period of early voting and on election day is the actual electorate. But we don't know what that is. I mean, we have a lot of really, you know, good ideas about it. We have a lot of data in the past. You know, people model it. There's a lot of things we can do, you know, to approximate that and to make, you know, what we like to think is a pretty educated guess. But ultimately, you know, you're trying to sample something that doesn't exist, which is very different in terms of than when you're doing policy polling or market research or any of the other exercises and survey research that you're trying to undertake. You know, you have a pretty good way of, I mean, if I want to do, you know, and we do some consulting on the side, if I have a client that wants to do research on, say, this is a bad example, but I'm going to use it anyway, cancer patients, well, you know, we know who cancer patients are. I don't, you know, again, I have a pretty good guess of who the voting population is, but, you know, until they actually go up and cast those ballots, I don't know. And with the extra, you know, sort of piece, you know, that we have now, in which we've got a lot of very active filters on the voting population, you can call it voter suppression or whatever, but in a more technical sense, states are, you know, creating filters on on the electorate. And I think figuring out how those filters work is very tricky, because we also have a secret ballot. And so your ability to validate votes is really pretty imperfect. I mean, I can't go back and verify how a person voted. I can verify what the vote totals are. I can do all kinds of things. In Texas, you know, in most places, I can tell who voted in a primary. It's a pretty good indicator, but it's not perfect. So sampling becomes really, you know, interesting, you know, for lots of reasons. And of course, there are lots of difficulties with drawing samples now that you're familiar with, that we can drill into more, that have to do with the death of landline polling, the emergence of using the internet, the emergence of cell phones, texting, mixed samples. When, you know, I mean, I think it's very in vogue right now to mix internet and phone samples. We've done that with some consulting work we've done. You know, I think it's interesting. I think it works in the right setting, but how does the sampling strategy fit what you're after is really key in that. And there's the notions of disclosure, and I'll talk about that a lot. You know, we're big fans of disclosure, but, you know, in echoing another point that I'll hit a lot as we talk today, you know, I mean, I'm really into disclosure because our own stuff, the work we did at UT as public pollsters and doing public survey work, you know, that open disclosure and full disclosure was a big part of our early brand. First, as we were doing it as a project at UT, and then as a project with UT and the Texas Tribune. Part of what, you know, we sold ourselves was a kind of radical transparency. So if you go to our website that Ann referred to, you can find not only a lot of the standard documentation, a summary, a crosstab, you know, all the documents that you should look for. You'll also find the actual data sets and the code books, which means you don't really have to take our word for it. If you know how to do this, you can open up the data, you can do whatever you want with it, you know, really in terms of checking our work, if you will. But I do think a basic level of disclosure that we'll talk about is really critical, and really kind of the baseline, I think, from the perspective of the kind of work that journalists do. Because the bottom line is, you know, you can like I said, I know a few reporters in this room. I like to think that people trust me, but I'm pretty reassured by the fact that they can trust but verify. And I think there's almost nothing quite more important than that, because disclosure can help undo other problems from your perspective. In other words, if there's a problem with our sampling, or we've misspecified the population or the number, any number of ways that we can make mistakes, or that somebody else, not making it so personal, that a campaign is fudging their sampling or their presentation, the cure to that is full disclosure. And I talk to reporters a lot about that when I get called and asked about other polls, in particular campaign polling, which is, a pet peeve of most, public-facing polls, which we can talk about why. And then what we call sound measurement. And this is, the execution and the methodology and the execution of the poll itself. How are you asking questions? What does your instrument look like? Are you following good practice? What does the question wording look like? And we'll talk about question wording a bit. Okay, so drilling down into some of the more technical points, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I'm getting a sense that people know a lot of this stuff. So, what do we need to know about everything? We need to know what the population of interest is, what I've talked about. And you need to know what the sample size is and whether the sample size, is appropriate to the population of interest. Now, in some ways, sample size, people can make a lot of sample size, although I think that, as the back end of where we get our data comes from, and we know more and more about who we're polling, which I think is an underappreciated piece of how polling has changed. A lot of emphasis on the changes in mode, in other words, things I've already mentioned, phone, internet, et cetera. But the other piece of this, I think, is a lot less attention, is how much more we know about our respondents in a lot of cases than anybody doing polling 30 or 40 years do. So, as we all know, there's a huge second market out there in secondary data. So, for example, if I'm asked to do a poll that oversamples in racial or ethnic groups, say Hispanics, which is sort of very common. Typically, when we wind up using data brokers to, in a sense, and this sounds terrible, and I should think of a different way to say this, but, to basically buy more Hispanics. So if we go and we know that Hispanics are kind of hard to include in your sample, we can go to our vendor that is doing the data collection and say, look, we're going to need, we want to oversample Hispanics, or we just want to do a survey of just Hispanics. Most people are not going to have enough Hispanics at the state level, and certainly to do, say, an urban level poll, to get a representative sample of Hispanics in that area. So what you really do is you go on the secondary market and you go out and you buy data on this open market, which is dominated by a few major companies, but has always seen new market entrants to buy data. And then you sort of assess what that data looks like, and you incorporate it into your random sample. You still randomize calls and distributions, and you do weighting with that data. But that has really changed the nature of polling. In some ways, maybe for worse, because it puts more pressure on the process of randomization, which we need. On the other hand, the ability to back check when we get a list of respondents that will be stripped of their name, but has pretty deep information about who they are, particularly where they live. It's very useful for us to be able to do that and help check particularly geographic and age representation. Because the market files that are now sort of on these things, we don't have to rely entirely on what we ask people and what they tell us, even though we often still ask the questions that are appended to the data file for respondents if you can afford that kind of a sample. And again, cost is an issue there. And then a methodology statement. There should always be, detailed information about how the poll was conducted, how the sample was drawn, what the modes were used, what the response rates were, things like this. You should always be able to see question wording. And that means basically, at the very least, if somebody says, here's this question, we asked this question and here's the result. If we say, X amount of people want gun laws made more strict, Y want them made less strict, Z, want them left as they are. You need to see exactly how that question was worded. For example, and again, I'm using examples that played our advantage, but did you rotate the more strict and the less strict randomly in the way you asked the question so that everybody didn't get more strict first? Because that's a slight cue. It's not a lot, but those kinds of things. So you need to be able to see the question, and I think optimally, and again, this is what we do, the questionnaire. You should be able to say, hey, can you send me the original wording of the questions so you can see how they were wording, what order the question was in, everything about how this was executed. So generally, as I've said before, disclosure and transparency. And again, I think this is kind of the baseline for the job that you guys are doing, to my mind. And I would ultimately like to see, a little more rigor in this. And again, plays to our comparative advantage for me to say that, that's fair. But I also think there are national standards that have evolved and professional best practices that do require this. And I'm often pretty surprised by how uneven full disclosure is, particularly in a lot of public polling. I also think that these standards help discount or help provide some kind of, a little bit of resistance and and it's a professional practice for you all, gives you something to fall back on when somebody calls you and says, hey, I released this poll result. How come you didn't write about it? Come on, write about it. Come on, write about it. No, come on. Not that ever happens. Come on, write about it. Come on, this is really important. You should write about it. Well, first thing you say is, okay, well, you send me the whole survey and and a methodology statement and everything, and I can consider it. And I think, from a couple of people I see nodding, that there were a lot of people that will not do that. And we can talk a little more about, I think why that happens in campaign polling. Okay, so that really does lead to contextualization, to my mind, right? And I think above all, what is the source? Who are the producers? Who are the sponsors of the data that you're being asked to use? And I know that, there are a lot of in-house rules that guide this. I think there's even some AP guidance on this now. But I think, pretty important to your readers to know where this came from. Particularly during campaign season, but also as we get into a lot of interest group activism using data, and we've done consulting work sometimes for interest groups, mostly nonprofits. But you need to sort of, your readers need to know where this came from, and they need to know a little bit about the organization, it seems to me. I think that's only fair both to you guys and to your reader. Now, avoiding overinterpretation. This is another one where, we could, I think I have a deck that's just about this. But I think this is the thing that's hardest and falls most directly on you as conduits for information about data to your readers and to the public. It's very easy to take a polling result and make more of it than it is. And there's a bunch of reasons that happens. One common problem is to take one individual polling result and say, okay, we know what people think. When, again, for all those reasons that I talked about, changes in question word, variation in question wording, different sampling strategies, timing, and just statistical variance. We do things with 95% confidence intervals. That means theoretically 1 in 20 things could just be an outlier. And 1 in 20 doesn't sound like a lot, but it kind of is. And that's a pretty high probability that something could be off. So this is why we talk a lot in this particular context about the fact that more polling is almost better. And I'm sure people have told you that. I used it as kind of a defense. For a while, we kind of were the only game in town in polling in Texas. It's been a while now. For the younger reporters, it's like, how could that have been? But one of the reasons I started doing this at UT was because there had been a standard poll in Texas, the Texas poll, that was run by a consortium of folks, some of whom were actually, for a little while, it was at UT, and it just went into abeyance. Basically, they ran out of money and interest. And for a while, there was just not very much statewide polling. So when we started doing statewide polling in Texas with the Texas Lyceum around 2004, 2005, our phone just started ringing off the hook because there was nobody else doing it. That was a very precarious position for us to be in, and it made my nerves really pretty raw because I have a lot of faith. I think we do good work. I think we're diligent. I like to think of myself as skilled. I like to think of myself as having attracted skillful and competent collaborators, but we're still human beings doing this. And so I think in terms of overinterpretation, I always urge people to look at are there any other people that have asked about this topic? Unpack how they've asked different questions. Now, if you have a limited word count, I get it. You can't spend 150 or 250 words of a 550 word budget talking, diving into the polling results. But I do think it makes a lot of sense, as a standard question, in the same way that you say, hey, is there anything else I haven't asked you? If you're talking to a pollster, you should say, hey, has anybody else polled on this? Are there any data in and around this that are similar to this result that we're talking about that you guys just released? Now, some people aren't going to want to tell you. But if they don't tell you and then you find it, you know something about your source, I think. It's a little nasty, but I think it's true. So I just think it's very, and then obviously during horse race polling and during election polling, it's very easy to overinterpret an election result. That's probably the thing that's most front and center right now. A headline declaring, this is a 2-point race. Well, maybe, 2-point race, asterisk. So I think you have to look at both things that are, synchronous in time or approximately synchronous in time, what's close. And I think, people generally do a pretty good job of this unless they're, sort of writing about an in-house poll. That gets a little bit harder, I think, or that is more complicated anyway. And then, across time, where does this fit into the trend? Now, obviously with poll aggregators and all this has become at once more common, but also a little muddier and more complicated because poll aggregators all aggregate polls in different ways, or generally aggregate polls in different ways. 538, uses some, Nate Silver magic or something to weight these, which is, Real Clear Politics doesn't weight their trend data, I don't think, in all of this. But all of that, still comes back to the point that, the biggest, hoariest cliche that anybody here who's ever talked to a pollster has heard is what? What's the most common thing a pollster tells you if they're being defensive? They're like a lawyer, I should never ask a question I'm not sure if you guys agree with me with. Polling cliches. This will be fun anyway. Biggest polling cliche. Snapshot in time, Jasper, my local talents. And I didn't preload that question, I swear. Yeah, the snapshot in time thing, right? I mean, people says, no, look, this is just like right now. It's a snapshot in time, so let's not. I mean, that's become a cliche because it's useful for us, and it also is true. And it's a good reminder to not overinterpret any particular result. So that gets you to sort of other trends as critical context, both or other results, trend and replication. I think the trickiest, but still the most important thing, and the thing that I urge people to think about, and look, you wind up calling guys like us because I'm not, I'm sort of first and foremost not first, I don't know. I'm at least as much of an academic, I like to think, or an interpreter as I am a producer of the data. But putting public opinion as situating public opinion as an element of the political process, I think, is both most interesting, most important, hardest to do. And so what do I mean by that? Example from Texas that the Texas reporters will recognize, and that I think actually was done, if you guys have touched on Texas politics at all, I could certainly point to examples in both Politico and the New York Times and the Washington Post of people doing this. So about a year ago, and then in the months that ensue, the Texas legislature is in session and they begin passing a series of what is uniformly recognized, including by the promoters of this legislation and the supporters, as very conservative legislation, right? Particularly on abortion, guns, a couple other things, transgender rights. But particularly, the things I probably talked to people the most about and that we polled on a lot was abortion and guns. Now, people looked at some of the results, particularly on abortion, and there emerged a kind of a storyline or a frame about this that I saw in a lot of places that I think didn't quite specify the political process the right way, which is, hey, look, they're overstepping. Obviously, the Republican leadership of the state is overstepping where public opinion is, particularly in their own party, because depending on how you frame the question and what policy you're focused on, there's not majority public support for a lot of this stuff. There wasn't majority public support for unlicensed carry. And depending on how you looked at the underlying attitudes, there was something to that. I mean, the problem with that was that some stories got this, and I think, frankly, for my friends in the room, state reporters got this a lot better than the national reporters did. But, that was actually, it wasn't, a lot of people want to stop there and then go and say then, so that means Greg Abbott's going to be in trouble in the fall. That is probably not the case, but we'll see. But I think it took a lot of digging and a lot of contextualization in the political process in the state to understand why there were a lot of other more plausible ways of reading that situation and understanding how public opinion, as we found it configured, and many found it configured, fit into the dynamics of the political system in the state. Having to do with, the relative weakness of the Democratic Party and calculations about that made by political entrepreneurs and elected officials in the state. The interest group universe in the state, and particularly the interest group universe within the Republican Party, and who was influencing the process, and how actors in the political process actually viewed public opinion, processed it, acted on it, incorporated it as a variable into their political strategies. Now, it's all pretty interpretive work, and it's all, and I know that, depending on your beat, depending on your organization, depending on the latitude you're given by your editors, there's a lot of things that give you some sense of that. But I think in terms of understanding that, it's almost always one of the most important and most difficult things to factor in when you're trying to write about public opinion, particularly when it's something other than just a horse race story. That has its own difficulties and requires the same kind, at least a parallel set of nuance, but it's not as easy to do. But this is like very difficult. I mean, I could pass on to you, some trading videos, or, we've thought for years about trying to, sell like a little data science unit, for reporters. There's all kinds of ways you can go and learn about the technical stuff. But this is much more difficult. And I think once you've made the technical judgments, this is what's really important, and I think really frames a lot of your stories. Okay, so a few State House considerations, and this is really just to get it starting. This goes back to the thing I said that I'd kind of avoided 2016 and 2020. State polling quality is highly variable, both within states and among states. State like Texas now, as I started to say a minute ago, we know there's like a lot of people in the pool here now. I mean, as a baseline regular occurrence, we poll at UT Austin. Don't tell the other people from UT, I assumed we were the only UT, then they get really cranky. But Dallas Morning News, UT Tyler. Quinnipiac now comes regularly. Hobby Center at University of Houston. I suspect because it's campaign season, public policy polling will be here trolling for business. That was like a little catty pollster comment. I'm probably missing someone else who's been here regularly. Oh, Emerson College, right, is now also somebody coming regularly into Texas to poll. Now, One of the problems in 2020 was that in some of those critical states, particularly in the upper Midwest, you had maybe one or two regular actors doing polling, maybe not even that much, and not polling that frequently. We now poll 6 times a year. So in terms of our contextualization and our ability to kind of say, yeah, this could be it, but let's wait and see what we get month after next, we're pretty comfortable with that. And I think there's a little bit of an arms race going on. We don't always talk to each other, but I think Hobby is polling about that frequently. I think UT Tyler is polling about that frequently. There's a lot of stuff going on. But in a lot of places, there isn't a lot of stuff going on. And we're also, not to be snotty, but I think, most of us doing, the Texas Lyceum, sorry, in Texas, I don't want to leave them out. Most of us that are doing public pollings, a lot of us that have been here a long time, we have a lot of experience. We like to think we know what we're doing. And you kind of see that in the results. I mean, they don't, we don't do what's called pooling. You know what pooling of results is? In polling, you call it you have to look out for pooling because people keep an eye on other people's results. And you find, a lot of research has found that where there's a lot of polling going on, you do sometimes get a pooling of results in which, because people are looking at whatever other people are doing, they're using shared assumptions, other kinds of things, results can pool around a median with a fairly small standard deviation sometimes. And that's usually a sign that something's not quite right, particularly in election polling if it seems competitive. But state polling quality is highly variable and the rate of polling is highly variable. And that kind of feeds back for those of you in states that don't have a lot of polling. I mean, it's something that to kind of watch and to fold back into your assessment of polls because, to go back to the cliche, you have fewer snapshots, right? And it makes it a little bit harder. And you have people that are often entrepreneurial and will come in from out of state and maybe make mistakes. I mean, I'm not saying they automatically make mistakes, but I can tell you, we got sort of overly ambitious on the consulting side and did polling in 4 or 5 states a few election cycles ago. It was much more difficult, and I was much more confident in our execution of that. I mean, I think we did pretty well, but again, that was like once, and I try not to take credit for one time it goes right, because when it goes wrong, you can't go, well, So, the other thing about Statehouse considerations is it really speaks to this part about context and a little bit touches on understanding kind of the political system at the local level. Legislative politics, Statehouse politics, it's a small world. I mean, we were just talking before about even the Texas political press corps overall is relatively small, and Texas is a pretty big state. And in Austin, it's a fairly limited universe. And I've got the high school comparison up there, and I'm glad that's basically, the Ross Ramsey go-to, comparing politics in the Capitol, who is the executive editor and kind of really the senior guy in the Texas political press corps. Talks a lot about it, and it pops up in his column a lot. We tease him about it, about politics in the Capitol as high school. But I think that's pretty common in state politics, that there's a lot of noise going on among the players in a relatively small pool. And that actually also goes into press coverage, poll coverage. I mean, there are people I know in the Texas press corps and in the Capitol that still think we're full of crap because they didn't like what we were doing like 15 years ago. Now, there are people probably that like us too much. Right? And I think all of that plays into this and you have to kind of take it, and people in a relatively small pool are, competing for local news time, they're competing for coverage, we've got our own. I mean, my institutional setting is, part of the reason I get to do what I do at UT is because I know we get a lot of press coverage. And we're in the clips all the time, and my dean can go to the president's office and our public relations people can go to the public relations people at the next level and go, yeah, these guys are doing great. So when budget times come, I don't get messed with very much. But that can matter, right? And so I think you have to kind of think about that. I also think another thing about Statehouse about Statehouse coverage that I think is really undersold, and this is part of the whole, I'll side with you guys on this, and everybody's dislike of horse race coverage is that, people get so focused on election and horse race coverage that they really miss how valuable sustained polling on policy is. I think, and I could give you lots of examples of why I think this really matters, helps coverage, helps in terms of the larger purpose of all this, helps the public understand what's going on in their communities. Just by luck, we started polling in 2008, and in our very early polling, we started asking questions about gay marriage. And so we got very lucky in catching what was, for policy attitudes, a really remarkable shift in attitudes with a lot of interesting internal characteristics. We saw Democrats move very rapidly, but we also saw a lot of Republicans looking for a middle ground. Nobody remembers now, but if you think back in terms of the politics of gay marriage, there was this whole talk about civil unions for a few years. And we saw Republicans moving from, I'm against it, but civil unions are okay. And that told us something about what the political environment looked like. And that changed in interesting ways as civil unions, sort of became not relevant anymore because the issue moved so fast. You could then track the Republicans who got on board and the Republicans who backtracked. Now, that's not the most interesting thing in the world, but it does tell you a little bit about what was going on out there in the world on something that was very front and center and very fundamental. We've seen interesting things, things like that on marijuana right now. I think we're seeing a lot of shifting around. We've seen a lot of moving around in marijuana attitudes. And this is way too simple, but I'm going to say it anyway. And right now, I think medical marijuana is a little bit like the civil unions of pot smoking, right? It's kind of like, no, a lot of people say, yeah, medical's fine. That's all right. By the time that becomes less relevant, we'll probably not really remember the day when medical marijuana seemed like maybe where we'd stop, I suspect. But we've been polling on it for a long time, and that's very helpful at the state level. And in terms of thinking about the political system, I think it does lead you, when you see that kind of movement in marijuana attitudes, it leads you to ask, kind of the opposite question that came up with the idea of guns and, whether the Republican Party has gone too far. It's like, if public opinion is really moving like this, including among Republicans, well, then how come it's getting no traction in the legislature? Or it's getting only limited traction in the legislature, and it requires a certain amount of familiarity with the dynamics of the system, where the choke points are, who the gatekeepers are, to understand where those bills are getting killed, right? And to not just, assume, as, marijuana advocates, whatever you think, like, this is inevitable, this is going to happen no matter what. Why don't we just do it now? I don't this is just a mistake. But the policy attitude polling really helps with that. It really helps with that in a lot. And it's not dramatic, and often the changes are gradual. And on a lot of things, more often than not, the story is stability. But by a long shot, the story is usually stability rather than change, which also frustrates people because change is such a better story than continuity. Right? It frustrates writers, it frustrates advocates, but it's the fact of most policy polling. That said, state policy questions, you have to be, this is a real overinterpretation piece, because we have to be very careful, and we have probably made we've made mistakes with this, I'm sure. No example comes to mind. But I'm sure we have. Is that public knowledge of state policy level, or policy levels at the state level, very limited among people. We get a lot of don't knows, undecideds, or, and what that means is, this goes back to some of that due diligence on something like this. This is why you have to be really, really, really diligent about question wording, because it's easy to encourage the expression of attitudes that don't really exist or are very shallow and are easily moved by the way that you ask the question. Now, there's a whole growth industry in that kind of polling, message testing polling or advocacy polling, not push polling, which is different, but that hinges on, that is related to that point where you're trying to figure out what you can say to people to get a result, but also that to get them to respond, at least theoretically, to a certain kind of message. But one of the things about looking at this in the State House is I sell looking at policy attitudes. I also caution you got to be real careful because, to my mind, typically the more detail in these questions, and people assail us all the time for saying, well, if you'd asked it this way, well, it's like, well, yeah, that's why we didn't ask it that way, right? And that goes for, both sides. So, and then another thing, tracking state and national interactions at the State House level, very important, but also difficult because you get a lot of noise. So, right now in this environment, and also during the Trump presidency, this was really, all you have to do is put the president in a question linked to some policy question at the state level, and you're just moving the results. That has to do with the dynamics of partisanship and how we know about that and what now we know about that. So I'm going to stop there because I've gone for a long time and I see Ann already she's getting her microphone ready. I'm observant, kind of. So anyway, let's talk. All our stuff, as Ann said, is here. We're all there. We do a bunch of stuff, do a podcast, frequently have reporters on the podcast, although I mix it up. It's kind of a playpen for me. It's got a pretty narrow listenership, which is fine with me because it allows me to do pretty much what I want. If you could tell me, who you write for and what you do, that'd be helpful to me.
Hi, Joe Bustos, reporter with the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina. Would you talk about the disappearance of landlines and the challenges that's presenting, and whether texting and internet polling is valuable versus actually talking to a live person?
Yeah. Okay, so I should disclose, one of the reasons that a lot of people are still want to beat us about the head and shoulders is because we were ahead of the curve. Yes, we were. We were ahead of the curve. We got in early doing internet polling with a company that at the time was based in Palo Alto, that ultimately, as we were going along with them, got bought out by YouGov, but it was a group called Polymetrics. So, they have like a kind of copyrighted secret algorithm sauce that's worked very well for us. I think it works better for something than others, but so just disclosure. Look, I think that this combination of, the thing that everybody in the room knows, from personal experience and from this being rehearsed, landlines obviously don't work anymore. And what we've seen is a creeping of the standard of the mixture of cell and landlines if you were just going to do a phone poll, and the creeping in of different methods of contact. Look, I think overall, these adjustments have been pretty successful. And again, we can talk again about the reasons in 2016 and 2020 there were problems, but by and large, I think the combination of there being multiple modes that we can use to contact people and knowing more about the sample we're getting that I was talking about earlier, the kind of more available data, has helped us overcome what is ultimately a sacrifice of strict randomization, which we used to rely on, which is why we did phone polls to begin with. But it is an unbelievably active space. We spend a certain amount of time just trying to keep up. And in some ways we're seeing weird returns. Like Pew updated, did anybody read the Neiman's Lab thing? Ann sent me this thing that came out on the Neiman Lab, or Neiman put out. That's a pretty good piece. It's a long piece on thinking about polling going into the cycle, and can send you the link like she sent it to me. One of the things that's in that article that's really interesting that I'd seen, but I was reminded of when I saw this, is that Pew announced after 2020, and Pew people consider gold standard, and they do very good work there, they're well funded, they can get really big samples, they can take their time. They're good at not trying to ride media cycles so they don't rush their stuff out, et cetera. But Pew has gone back to actually doing more mail recruitment. I mean, like real snail mail. The secondary literature I've seen on that says that has helped like get some hard to reach groups in. I wouldn't do it. But what that shows is something that I kind of realized about a year and a half, well, I guess it would have been a year and a half ago. When I say a year and a half, it probably means 3.5 years ago. I've got that same COVID thing we all do. My partner Josh makes fun of me, is like when I say 5 years, it could be anywhere from 3 to 10. It's also age. I went and gave a talk or moderated a panel. I think I moderated a panel at the Associated Political Consultants meeting that was in Austin. So this is all political consultants. Now, political consultants have a different set of requirements and in terms of disclosure, in terms of professional norms. On one hand, they're very subject to the market and to market checks because it's all kind of contract private business. On the other hand, they're also very free to try new stuff, like some of the things you talked about. And having come from a kind of slightly rigid academic background and a kind of, and I would like to think kind of public interest oriented background in this, I was amazed at just how much it was the Wild West out there. When you go and talk to people, it's like, yeah, well, we've been experimenting with, take all those examples that you mentioned and mixing them and matching them like crazy. Like, yeah, I don't know, we sent somebody a letter and then if they wrote us back, we emailed them and pushed them to the internet or had them call us or gave them a choice. And so it is, and that's why kind of paying attention to how people do this is pretty important. But I would also say that, we will almost certainly find out later on that some of these things had unintended consequences and unintended effects on the work we do. That a decent answer to your question?
I guess I spoke a few months ago. I spoke to a Trafalgar Group founder, Robert Calais, and he talked about he used text messaging to reach people. No, he talked about using text messages to reach
text
people.
Messaging is kind of like the modal solution right now, in some ways. I mean, it's been a hot thing for a little bit now. Is that you nudge people versus text, or you send them the text, and that's, to my mind, that's a function of the data piece, because in the same way that there's been a million stories, and we all know that for a lot of things that we interact with on, in digital space, we're the product. I mean, and cell phone numbers, we have a lot of cell phone numbers and a lot of people a lot of information about who's attached to those cell phone numbers. I mean, you kind of think yourself, unless you're somebody that's hyper conscious of this, and I think it's the rare person that's 100%. I mean, you get asked for your cell phone number to confirm things all the time. It's like, hey, let's, and they do it in the name of, they tell you it's in the name of security. Like, let's make sure that we're securing your stuff, give us your cell phone number, and we'll send you a text. Well, they've got all your stuff, right? So I think that's one of the reasons that is so prominent. So I think, we are seeing, there's enough use of that I think it's been reasonably validated so far.
And one more follow-up. What's the appropriate length of a poll?
I had a methodology professor in graduate school. He used to say, how long should your legs be? Long enough to reach the ground. I don't think there's an appropriate length. I think our feeling is, one, it depends on mode. I think you can go a little longer on a digital device than you can in an individual interview, because people will sit and fill out a survey online, and they might be able to get up and walk away and then come back and finish it. And if they walked away for 3 hours or something, because that comes back in the data file, how long they were. But on the phone, I mean, you have very high discontinuation rates on the phone. So for us, if we're doing a phone poll and the volume of questions we have seems to be pushing something past about 15 minutes, I start getting nervous. What I know is it's going to get more expensive. And the vendor will tell you that, right? They'll say, hey, this is pretty long. It's going to take us an extra week to collect this because our discontinuation rate is going to be so high. I mean, that's kind of a mechanical thing that, the regular Texas poll we keep it about 15 minutes online, and we don't get a lot of discontinuation, unless, and I can't think of an instance where this has happened, unless we screw up and ask a question that causes people to hang up or stop and go, hey, I'm not, what are you doing here? Does that answer your question? It's a little bit, it's a fluid question. Look, I would say that to the extent that we can, we keep it as short as possible. But it kind of depends on what really depends on what you're trying to do. And again, something I should have in here is on budget, right? The longer you're going to go, the more it's going to cost you.
So in the 2020 election, we had this kind of well-documented occurrence in several South Texas counties where there was just a big spike in Republican turnout, and these are all Latino majority counties. And then looking ahead to the March primary, some of those counties, again, comparing to previous election cycles, just had these crazy spikes on the Republican side. So I'm wondering, I guess, when you're polling for, say, the November 2022 election, how do you approach a situation like that, like in Starr County, where there were 15 Republican voters one year and then 1,000 the next cycle, and then B, from a reporting perspective, what's kind of the best practice for if we see, a lot of the contested congressional races in Texas will be in those counties. So, does that just mean we need to be more diligent about not taking too much stock in one poll, for instance?
Well, what I would say about that, and I suspect either Josh or I have probably said this to you, that, there's a couple of different things to unpack there. At a basic methodological level, I would never say that a statewide poll that we did, unless we set out to make sure we were wanting to account for what was going on in Starr County or the 4 RGV counties or whatever, I would not say that, there's a particular methodological fallacy at work here that you can extrapolate from the overall result to a limited subset, and particularly one that small. So the main thing I would say is that we don't really have anything to say directly about that particular, what the hell's going on in Starr County, or even in this one legislative race in those adjacent counties. So as far as that goes, what that really requires and is a separate poll. And we get this all the time where people come to us and say, hey, I want to do a poll, and I want to do a Texas poll, but I want to make sure that I know a lot about this region or this county or this city. And what we really have to tell people most of the time is that's actually 2 polls. I can't supplement this enough in most cases to just kind of add a few more people and call it representative. You have to do a random draw in the, this goes back to the second slide, underlying population. Those are 2 very distinct underlying populations, maybe even 3. If you're talking about Hispanics in a region, or compared to or even more so Republicans in a region. So I think, one has to be very careful about, from a technical point of view, how many respondents are in that cell. So if you think about it as a spreadsheet or a chart, and you're starting to say, okay, we have a 1,200 person sample. We want to say something about Republican, Hispanics in a border adjacent county. It's a very small cell number. It means it's going to have a margin of error of about 15. Does that make sense? Yeah. I have a lot to say about that broader topic, but we've got about 6,000 words on that right now, and it's about third in the queue. I'm the bottleneck. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a reporter in Delaware where polling is basically non-existent.
Right.
So I'm curious if you have any advice or resources on kind of filling that blind spot, but also when a poll is released, usually by the University of Delaware, for example, like marijuana is a big thing in terms of legalization efforts.
Yeah.
And there's a 2018 poll that everyone hangs their hat on. And I'm just curious if there's a statute of limitations in your eyes, or like what do you do when there's so limited polling, but you want to find out how the public feels about it, specifically with public policy?
Well, I think two things there. One of those is something I like, which is like a strategy entrepreneurial question, which is like, how do you convince people to do polling, right? But I'm going to go to the second question first. I mean, I think, we, mechanical answer. If you've got one poll on marijuana in Delaware from 2018, and it's all you got, I mean, I think what you have to do is find comparable contextual cases. You have to compare it to national data, which you're going to find a lot of change in that period, probably. Again. And I would go with comparable probably, and now I'm being a Texan, and then, it's like going to confession. Before I came to Texas, I was in California, sorry. So, I don't have like nuanced versions of exactly how I would have to think about this a little bit more. But I would also look at regionally adjacent states and see where there will be more polling in New Jersey, for example, I would think, like a lot more. And I would build a pattern of like, yes, this is all we got. It's changed everywhere else. I can't say it's changed here, but it's more likely that it's changed than not, unless there's something about marijuana culture in Delaware I don't know about, which could be, I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to go about that, but it takes somebody who is like really dedicated to going out and beating the drum and then beating the financial bushes and saying, we are really lacking not knowing, the argument depends on the audience, whether it's an academic audience or a civic audience. Like, we really need to know more about what the people of Delaware think about public issues. This is a gap.
Hi, I'm Brenna. I'm with Bloomberg in Arizona.
Oh, okay.
And I wanted to ask about the question of likely voters. And so two things that I'm thinking about in Arizona are, one, that there will be voting law changes in place by November that weren't in 2020, that will either change how people vote or maybe discourage them from voting. Then the second thing is, I think there's a question in Arizona about whether the continued kind of relitigation of the 2020 election will actually affect Republican turnout if people just don't trust the system or think that, they don't trust a voting machine or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if polling methodology would try to kind of predict some of those things. And if not, if there is then kind of a caveat on some of the polling about 2022.
Well, second question first. Well, overall, very difficult to do. If you look at it's very difficult, I think, to model those things. And I'm not a big modeler, but if you look at the litigation, and this is like not exciting reading, but if you look at the litigation in Texas over voter ID, the Attorney General and the plaintiff, and that was defending the voter ID law, and the plaintiffs that were trying to get it undone, which I think in that suit was probably a combination of MALDEF and another couple groups, went out and hired up a bunch of experts to do a kind of post hoc modeling of what you're asking about. And it's kind of hilarious, and I know kind of guys on both sides. And the judge just, pardon my French, just crapped all over both of them. I mean, it was just like, you could tell the judge was almost like pissed off that he'd had to read it. And just said, none of this was helpful. This is like, and part of that is that it's difficult, right? So, and it's difficult for some of the reasons that I was talking about in terms of the likely voter modeling in very schematic terms before. Because it's hard to actually validate who voted and how. And voter registration laws vary. Like, one of the big problems in Texas is twofold. on your registration form, you provide neither an ethnic or racial identification information, and you don't register as a member of a party here. So right away, when you go and you pull the voter file, you don't have that information. Now, you can extrapolate partisanship in the way that a bunch of you that have covered campaigns are familiar because consultants do it this way. You can go and you can pull the voter file, figure out who's voted in what primaries. But after that, you're extrapolating from, Census Bureau tracts and the ethnic composition of those Census Bureau tracts. In some cases, you're making, and people have gotten in trouble with this like crazy, extrapolations from last names, right? Which is a nutty way to do it. But, if you just put a little weight on it, maybe it helps. I don't know, as you're building these models, right? I think in terms of polling, it depends on how much money you have to work with. Because you can go to the voter file, and again, I'm not a big modeler, like I've said. So, but off the top of my head, there are ways you can do that, or you can try to do that, but it tends to be very general and thus far not very successful. Now, the people that run those databases will tell you it's great, and that in some cases it is, their modeling is fairly predictive of who's going to turn out. But if you're doing that with the goal of figuring out who, I think, whose vote choice, or not their vote choice, but whose decision to vote or not to vote was affected by a particular rule, it's pretty difficult. The Hobby School did a thing, and some of the Texas people might remember this. I think it was 2018, where they looked at the biggest congressional district in the state, which is one of the biggest non-state congressional districts in the country, CD23. And they did a combination of survey research, interview, analysis of the voter file to figure out what the impact of the voter ID was. And I think it was the 2018 election. It might have been 2016, but I think it was 2018. And what the best that they could find there, which was hailed as like finally something that looks pretty reliable because it was done pretty solidly, was to find that there was a share of people that didn't show up to vote, that did seem to have particular demographic characteristics, and I think it was Hispanic, and there was something else that was kind of in there. But it wasn't because they were denied, it's because they showed up and didn't have the ID, which is kind of the scenario everybody was envisioning. It was because they were misinformed about what the requirements were, and they thought they would be denied, and so they didn't go. And after all that work, it was, I don't know, it was like 2 or 3% or something. It was something, but it wasn't like, so you might want to look that up just to see how they did that. And I think that was Mark Jones and somebody else, and I'm pretty sure it was at the Hobby School.
I really appreciate you coming in.
Sure. Thanks, y'all.